Hey guys, Alan here, Solid Rock Bible Class. As you can tell, I am in my office with my green screen here, and I apologize for no fireplace chat this morning, having some technical difficulties with my laptop. So we've been staying down the line of character traits of Jesus, and we're still going to be there. And I'm coming back to a subject that I have talked about in the past, but in some of my studies this week, I just kind of took a different twist to it to some degree. So we're going to be talking about the word holy, holy, being conformed to the image of Christ. So may my life be clean and pure and free from sin because it's regulated by God and by God's word. The psalmist David said in Psalms 145:17, "The Lord is my righteousness in all his ways and holy in all his works." I think that's extremely interesting since we're going to be talking about David here as we go forward. Let's look real quick over into 1 Peter, the first chapter, verses 15 and 16. "But as for he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation. Because it is written, Be ye holy, for I am holy." So we're going to go back here to David as we take this, and I want to pick up another verse here back into the book of Acts, the 13th chapter, verse 22. "And when he had removed him, he raised up unto David to be their king, to whom also he gave testimony and said, I have found David the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, which shall fulfill all my will." That's in the book of Acts. What's interesting is, we think about David, and I think probably all of us think about him and we think of him as king and such a great man. And a man after God's own heart. I go back to being a kid and that song that we probably have all sang here, "Only a boy named David, only a little sling, only a boy named David, but he could pray and sing. Only a boy named David, only a rippling brook, only a boy named David, but 5 little stones he took." You know this song, and it goes on. "And one little stone went in the sling, and the sling went round and round. And one little stone went in the sling, and the sling went round and round, and round and round and round and round and round and round and round, and then all of a sudden we see the giant come tumbling down." But David, he was a great man that stood out in the Bible. But then maybe in his life, maybe there should be a second verse, definitely one that nobody sings. Maybe they should sing it occasionally to understand that David was a real man with real problems. Only a king named David, only an evening, only a little fling, only a king named David, only a prolonged gaze, only a king named David. This would mark his days. Some sad things happened to David. Few people have ever rose to the heights of David. And few people have ever went down to the depths that David went down to. We're going to be in the book of 2 Samuel, the 11th chapter. And I'm going to pick up in verse number 1 here. We'll be coming back to a lot of these in reading, so I probably won't read the entire text up front here. And it says, "And it came to pass after the years was expired, that it was time for kings to go forth to battle. And David sent Joab and his servants with him and all of Israel. And they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried still in Jerusalem." Notice, David normally should have been out with his troops. And then we look into that second verse, and it says, and it came to pass in the eventime that David arose from off his bed, and he walked upon his roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. And David sent and inquired after the woman. And one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Elam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" And David sent messengers and took her. And she came into him, and he lay with her, and she was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned unto her house. So, we can look into the book of James here. And we read about temptation. It says, "And every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. And sin, when it's finished, bringeth forth death." I think we can all ask ourselves the question here, when it comes to sin, where are we headed? What is that battle that you are facing in regards to sin? We're all facing a battle in regards to sin. And it's really, truly a battle. David was facing a battle on the battlefield that he wasn't at. But he had even a larger battle, we see here. And sin, it's our most critical battle. Sin is the most serious battle David had to undertake, and sin is the most serious battle we have to take. It's important that we battle sin. We can't sit on the sideline here. It's a battle, and we have to engage ourselves. In 2 Samuel, the 11th chapter, back to our text here in verse number 1, and it says, "And it came to pass after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Ramoth. But David tarried still in Jerusalem." David was idle when he should have been busy. David had victory all over the place. He had won every war that God had put him into. And David was at a pinnacle of his life. The battle here David was up against, it didn't take very long. In fact, David didn't put up much of a fight whatsoever. Yet this battle, it took and it shook all of history. David did not go into this evening intending to sin. David was not prepared for this battle. We need to take and prepare ourselves for battle. We need to prepare ourselves. What will I do when I face with this circumstance? And you know what? David's enemies here, which was Satan, was playing for keeps. And devil plays for keeps every time. You look sometimes at current wars, and we have like the Geneva Convention and some kind of rules of engagement. Satan doesn't have that. It's all hands on deck. In the battle with sin, there's no rules of engagement. Satan will hit us every which direction. And our enemy is playing dirty, and he's playing for keeps. Peter said in 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter, verse 11, "Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims." And then he goes on and he says, "Abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul." This is no little battle. It's serious. If you don't take it serious, you're going to be in trouble with your Christian life. Nothing is off limits for Satan, as I said. Sin will never say something's off limits. Sin will never say, don't go there. Notice sin had no boundaries here with David, as we read just a moment ago. Look at the words that were used. Look at the verbs that were used. It says, he saw, he sent, he took, he lay. Let's look at verse 2. "And it came to pass at the eventime that David arose from his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself. And the woman was very beautiful to look upon." he saw here. We may not be able to take and to avoid seeing. We may not even take and say here to David, David, you're wrong for seeing, because sometimes that eye gate, you catch things you don't even want to catch. But we do have to turn around and blame him for staring, allowing himself this idle time, allowing himself to take and entertain himself with the thoughts here that are off limits to him. In our lives, so there may be some things that we may not be able to avoid seeing, but you can do something else other than step into sin. And David, he could have done something else here after he saw. You know, maybe it would have been good for David to go back and write another psalm. Maybe it would be good if David had just read some of the psalms he had already wrote. Here's a psalm that had already been written at the time that David was on that rooftop in Psalms, the 63rd division, verse 6. When I remember thee upon my bed and meditate on thee in the night watches, because thou hast been my help. Therefore, in the shadow of thy wings will I rejoice. David needed to draw closer to God at this point in his life, but he didn't. So the next thing we see is, it says he sent. And he may not have sent someone at this particular point, he will later, to the house at this point. I think he just probably inquired, who is this lady? And they said, hey, it's Bathsheba, it's Uriah's wife. You know her dad, you know her grandfather. In fact, her grandfather works for you. David knew the family. Then it says, then he sent messengers. By the way, we're going to stop right here for just a split second. And I'm not going to take and blame anything here in regards to Bathsheba. She could have had all types of thoughts here, but nothing here that we look at in the Bible is laid at the feet of Bathsheba. You know, as you say, well, why in the world would she come to the palace? Well, first of all, the king summoned her. And she could have had thoughts of, hey, possibly my husband has been hurt. Maybe one of my other relatives in battle had been hurt. So she goes and she presents herself to the king, as the king had requested. But as I say, you'll never find anything in the Bible that ever takes and says Bathsheba was at fault in this issue. But plenty of fault, as we look at it, is played out as far as being David's fault. Plenty of fault is laid at David's feet. So let's not cast a lot of negative towards Bathsheba at this point. Scripture blames David. David saw, he sent for her, and then what did he do? It says he took her. We usually take something that we feel that we have a right to. You know, you see this in government, don't we? We see it in politics. We see it in government. We also see it in business. Sometimes we see it in the church. Sometimes we just see it in other places in our life. So David, with his fame and his power, may have come to a point here that he just feels he's got the right. I'm the king. So he took. God's plan for the king is the same plan that he has for you and I. He doesn't have a different plan. He doesn't have a different standard for the king or the president or the governor or the pastor or a business leader He has no different plan that he has for you and I. It's the same plan. In 2 Samuel, the 5th chapter, verse 13, it says, and David took him more concubines and wives out of Jerusalem after he was come from Hebron. And there were yet sons and daughters born to David. He had all of these wives. He had all of these concubines. By the way, what was God's plan? What was God's plan? What's the plan God has for us in our life? Let's look back briefly into the book of Deuteronomy, because it says something in regards to kings. And remember, there's no difference of a standard from a king in us. Deuteronomy, the 17th chapter, verse 15. It says, Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. So, first of all, he tells Samuel, the only person that's to be king is somebody that I choose. And then he goes on and he says, one from among the brethren shalt thou set king over thee. Thou mayest not see a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother. It needed to be somebody that was an Israelite. And it had to be somebody that God chose. And then he goes on in verse 16. I'm not going to read verse 16, but I'm going to jump to verse 17. And he goes on and says, neither shall he multiply wives to himself, and his heart turn away. Neither shall he greatly multiply himself silver and gold. Notice, God's plan was not to have multiple wives. And God's plan for us is not to have multiple wives. Remember back in verse 15 that we just looked at, it says that it'll draw our hearts from him. It'll draw our hearts from God. So God's plan was not to have multiple wives. Look down to, in the same chapter, Deuteronomy 17, let's look down to verse 20. And it says that his heart be not lifted up above his brethren, and that he turn not aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, to the end that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. Notice it says that his heart be not lifted up. And then it goes on, it says that he turn not aside from the commandments. He needed God's man, which is us, which was King David at that time there, but it's us, each one of us. We don't need to be turned aside. Our hearts shouldn't be lifted up with pride and us turned aside. So that goes to say, as we step back into Samuel, now we see that he lays with her. David takes and crashes through all of these roadblocks, all these barriers that God took and put in his way. You know, sin just doesn't have a conscience. Sin just doesn't have boundaries. You know, sexual impurity, greed, covetousness, you know, whatever. Sin's sin. But notice he just blew through all of these barricades, all of these red flags that were waving at him, all these flashing red lights. Sin is our most brutal, serious battle. Sin, it knows no boundaries. You know, sin brings our own blindness. And sin just flat brings brutality. Look at verse 4, back in 2 Samuel, the 11th chapter, verse 4. And it says, and David sent messengers and took her. And she came into him, and he lay with her, for she was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned into her house. David sent her back home. It's all over with. One night stand, a fling. That's it. It's all done. You know, maybe I shouldn't have done that, he says to himself, you know. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. But, you know, I'm the king. I can do what I want. I'm entitled to it. I'm the king. Sin blinds us. Other people can't do this, by the way, but I can. Then it says, as we get into verse 5, and the woman conceived and sent and told David and said, I'm with child. So what does David do at this point? He starts putting a plan together. He calls for a husband to come home from battle, Uriah. Send Uriah back. I need to get an update on the war. Can you imagine as he kneels before David, as Uriah takes and kneels before David, what in the world's going through David's mind right now? What goes through his mind? So after he gives the report, he says, okay, we'll go home. We'll see you tomorrow. Didn't work, did it? So the next day, what's he do? He takes and gets him drunk. Still didn't work, didn't send him home. He says, how can I go out and do this when all of my brethren are at war? So what's David do? He takes and he puts together a sealed letter, takes and put his insignia on it, sends it to Joab. Notice sin has just totally blinded David. Look how far down the path it's taken him. He tells Joab to take and put Uriah in the heat of the battle. And once he's in the heat of the battle, let's pull back our forces a little bit and just see how well that he can fight. And of course, Uriah was killed. Sin blinds, and sin is brutal. And David's on an absolute crash course here. Again, sin, it's our most serious battle. Sin, it doesn't know any boundaries. Sin brings its own blindness and brutality. And sin is absolutely anything but beautiful. David took and looked at a woman that was beautiful, but the sin wasn't beautiful. David may not have been able to take and say, he may have been able to take and say, that was a beautiful woman, but what happens after that? It's not pretty. David could have said, I can't have this in my life. But no, David took her. Skip down to verses 9 and 10 here in the text in 2 Samuel, the 12th chapter, verses 9 and 10. He says, wherefore hath thou despised my commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight? Thou hast killed Uriah the Hittite with a sword, and hast taken his wife to be thy wife, and hast slain him with the sword of the children of Ammon. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from thine house, because thou hast despised me and hast taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be thy wife. So remember, Nathan the prophet took and came to him, told him that story about a man who had a single little sheep and how another man took that sheep and killed the sheep. And don't have time really for the whole story that Nathan told him. And of course, David said, you're the man. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And then he goes ahead and we see here that pretty much judgment is coming on David here. Verse number 11, thus saith the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against thee. Notice he says, out of thine own house, and I will take thy wives before thine eyes, and give them unto thy neighbor, and he shall lie with the wives in the sight of the sun. Verse number 12, for thou didst it secretly, but I will do this thing before all of Israel and before the sun. David, you did this in secret, but I am going to shout this absolutely from the rooftops. I'm going to do what you did. I'm going to take this public. Sin's not pretty. So we see that David is cast from his throne by the sword, by his own son, Absalom, who took and stole the hearts of the people. Now David is running for his absolute life. He's running from his own son. And then what happens with Absalom? He takes David's wives. Interesting, isn't it? He takes David's wife. He takes David's wife to the rooftop of the palace. He sets up a tent up on the rooftop. He parades David's wives into the rooftop tent in the sight of all Israel. And Absalom follows them into the tent. No one in Israel wonders what in the world's going on. Absalom absolutely despised his father. Where's the beauty here now? After Nathan the prophet takes and points at him and says, "You are the man." Again, sin is our most serious battle. It doesn't know any boundaries. It brings its own blindness. It brings its own brutality. Sin must be battled, and we must engage in that war. We can't sit on the sideline. So, the 12th chapter, 2 Samuel, verse 13, and David said unto Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said unto David, the Lord also hath put away thy sin. Thou shalt not die. You remember when Saul took and he was king and he sinned? He blamed everybody. He blamed everything. He had every excuse in the world, didn't he? You know, it's the people. Or this is what I'm trying to do for God. David doesn't do any of that. David said, I have sinned. Can you imagine the relief that maybe that David had after he took and he confessed his sin? David just said, I have sinned. And what happened there? That opened that door for forgiveness. But he's still going to have a bunker crop. Whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. He confesses his sin, but he still has to pay the price for what he sowed. In the book of 2 Corinthians, the 10th chapter, verse 4, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God, to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations, and every high thing that is exalted into it against the knowledge of God, and bringeth into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. We need to take and ask God to keep us close to him. We need to ask God to keep our character in check. We need to live within the provision God has given us. God always took and gave David everything he needed. But transgression, it goes beyond what God's provision is. Let's look at the psalmist David here just for another second. In Psalms 32, division 32, verse 1. Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. He wrote this after this particular incident. So our prayer that we have, it needs to be to God that we take and may run in the opposite direction of sin. Sin is not pretty. Sin has no character. Hey guys, remember, we have been called to a life of holiness. I will catch up with you guys later. Thank you.